Hello, listener. This is The Way In, a podcast about finding our way through the often impenetrable worlds of psychotherapy, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis. I'm your host, Tyson Connor. I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist and clinical supervisor in Washington State. Each episode of this show, I talk with other mental health professionals about the work they do and topics they care about, using language that you don't need an advanced degree to understand. Come join us as we try to find the way in. And today, my guest on the podcast is Brian Pendergast. Brian is a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, author, teacher, and aspiring comedian in the greater Seattle-Tacoma area.
Yay.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And today, Brian will be our guide into the topic, narcissism and its vicissitudes. Is that how you say that word?
That's how I would say it, yeah.
Vicissitudes. Let's hop into it. We're talking about narcissism today, but specifically, we're talking about narcissism through lenses that maybe people aren't generally used to talking about narcissism through. Yes?
Yes. And can we first talk about how narcissism is the best disorder?
Why is it the best disorder?
I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory.
Oh,
isn't it?
right. Yes. Obviously. It's grandiose for sure.
Yeah.
It took me way too long to get that joke.
It's okay. I said I'm an aspiring comedian. I didn't say I had made it yet.
So let's speak broadly about narcissism first, just that we can lay some groundwork, right? Listener, if you're coming into this and your only exposure to narcissism as a category is hearing that like such and such is a narcissistic trait and you need to cut narcissists out of your life, what do we mean when we talk about narcissism, at least today?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I've noticed in my work with clients and in my own work in therapy is that narcissism as a word gets so associated with narcissistic personality disorder, the disorder in the DSM that is very problematic, and it has a very specific archetype to it a lot of times. And so because of that, we are only able to see it in negative, dark, problematic terms.
So most people, when they hear about narcissism, what they'll associate to are the sorts of things that we associate with narcissistic personality disorder, which are largely bad. They're things that you don't want. They're things that you don't want around you. They're things that if they're a part of you, it's a problem.
Right.
This makes me think of, there was this mini book-length essay called The Selfishness of Others. Kristen Donbreck is from like 2016. And part of her point was that this category of narcissism most often gets applied to just people who we have decided are being selfish. And that's kind of what her thesis was, that we use that word to mean someone I think is selfish in a way that is not fully human, or in a way that I don't have to really think about very hard or just consider wrong or bad on a fundamental level.
Yeah, or I would even wonder just if our subjectivity about the way that someone's selfishness affects us can cause us to label their behavior or their character as narcissistic.
Yeah. So before we go much further, the question I like to ask interviewees before diving into the outline, what brings you to this topic? All theory is autobiography. So what about this topic interested you?
Probably my narcissism.
Oh, what about it?
Growing up an only child, so there's already kind of a bit of a petri dish for lots of attention and some grandiosity. I got lots of positive attention from my mom, and I got lots of negative attention from my dad, but it was still lots of attention.
Right.
And there became this way of dealing with my life and my world where I didn't have to share because I didn't have siblings, so I didn't learn that. And I kept a lot of things inside of me, and I had a lot of fantasies. And so I didn't like anybody invading those fantasies. And so I would often then get into relationships with people and kind of try to live out of those fantasies. A great example of it was when I was a youth pastor at a church years ago. It was a pretty big church and a pretty big youth group, and there were lots of volunteers that were a part of this operation of like taking care of youth in the community and helping put on events and provide instruction, all these different things. But I had such a picture in my head for like how the whole thing should run that I didn't even let my volunteers be a part of any kind of visioning or dreaming or planning. It was just like, no, it has to be the way that I dreamed it up and the way that I want to do it. And inherent in that is a grandiosity. Like, I don't need all you people and your ideas.
Right.
I can do this all by myself.
Right.
And so I think reckoning with that way of being and to be able to call it narcissism, but to be able to, as we'll talk about in the interview here, loosen the reins on what that means a little bit has been really healing for me. So that's probably the other angle of it, that I want to talk about narcissism because I want to redeem the word a little bit. I want to get it out into the regular culture vernacular to be able to say, can we talk about this more openly and without immediately having a trigger reaction that sends us down a particular path of an archetype of what this is, which often ends up being Donald Trump, right? Which, I'm with you. That feels like the most problematic iteration of narcissism. And yet, can we find other ways of understanding what the word might mean to us in our culture and therefore maybe heal a little bit?
Right. There's sort of a cultural moment where the word narcissism and the word sociopath and the word abusive kind of can all be used as shorthand of that's a bad person with power and we don't like them.
Right.
And it sounds like part of what you're up to right now is trying to be able to engage with this category in a way that allows for not just like humanity, but also for like curiosity and like discovery, that it could actually be generative as opposed to just pathologizing and like, bad, go over there.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, the conversations I've had in my own therapy and with clients and even just colleagues at times about narcissism being something that we can learn to own in ourselves and that actually takes away some of the destructive power of it. Those conversations have been very enlightening for me and for others. And I think that that's more of what I'm interested in when this comes to this topic.
Yeah. And listener, you've already heard us use the word grandiosity a couple times. And I want to delve down on that a little bit because I think it means something specific. I can feel frustrated in conversations about narcissism because we end up only talking about a particular kind of narcissism that holds oneself in very high regard. That sort of like big personality, I think I'm so great, that kind of grandiosity. But grandiosity isn't just I'm so great. Grandiosity, as it's helpful for me to think about it, is I'm so big. Sometimes grandiosity is I'm the worst thing in the world.
Yep.
That can also be a narcissistic function. That can be a narcissistic grandiosity. Grandiosity is prioritizing one's own subjectivity to a point of ridiculousness. It's one way of defining it there. Does that sit with?
It does. Yeah. I think I've heard it called covert narcissism. I've heard it called inverted narcissism.
Yeah.
Those definitions fit for this idea of, narcissism isn't just the big CEO jerk who's sitting there spouting off stuff about how amazing he is. It's also the person that gets walked on all the time in their behaviors, in their relationships, and they are saying, I'm so good at it. I've got broad shoulders. I'm the best at being, walked on. Or I'm a really, really depressed person can also have narcissistic features because they're like, I'm the best at being the worst.
Yeah.
In a way, right? And along those lines, I'm a Swiftie myself, so I'm just going to put that out there. I took my daughter to the concert this last summer. It was amazing.
Y'all were part of the earthquake.
Yeah. But one of her, newer songs, Anti-Hero, she uses the phrase, my covert narcissism. And I just love that, like, it's getting out there a little bit more for us to understand the nuanced versions of this word and of this struggle. I'll call it a struggle more than a disorder, in my opinion.
Yeah, I like that. A little bit about the idea of pathologizing, right? This category. We've called it pathologized and pathologizing and problematic. And what we mean by that, listener, pathologizing something or to pathologize something means to approach it as if it's a bad thing that needs to be fixed. It is a sickness that needs to be healed. It's just all bad. And a common pitfall of the realm of psychology is to approach things through the lens of what's wrong with this. And that's also true when we take the language of psychology and use it in other contexts. It's sort of preloaded with this idea of, well, this is broken, bad, and wrong. So with that in mind, can narcissism be healthy?
Yeah, I go to some of these kind of real common examples in life that happen to a lot of us that help me get a grasp of how narcissism can be healthy. And one of the main ones is like a job interview. Like you have to show up to a job interview if you want to get the job, acting as if you are the best for that job.
Right.
And probably that you are bigger than what you normally would be. You're putting your best foot forward that might not be the way that you're going to function all the time in that job. Same with the first date. Same if you're going to like dream big. I'm going to start a nonprofit and you have nothing to start with. And you're just like, no, I'm going to do this. Like dreaming big requires some form of grandiosity that can feel in comparison big when you're not feeling that big, right? When you don't have any evidence to show that you can do something that big.
Yeah. So what differentiates a healthy narcissism from self-confidence?
That's a great question. I think the big indicator is when we are integrating our narcissistic self, because I'm a huge proponent of understanding human personality as multiple, and we've talked about this before, that we have all these different parts, all these different selves. And so I think we have a narcissistic self, every single one of us.
Yeah.
And if we can integrate our narcissistic self, which means to like acknowledge it, to say, oh, yeah, I have narcissism. Ooh, my narcissism just showed up right there. The more able we are to do that kind of thing, I think then we're able to employ the narcissistic self in moments when it needs to be generative. And then we're able to then lessen the amount of times that it's destructive.
Yeah. And listener, I realize we've used this word a couple of times too. Generative can be thought of as like the opposite of destructive, right? Generative is creative and produces things. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the characteristics of narcissism. So we've talked about grandiosity. That's a part of it. What are the other elements of narcissism so that while we're thinking and talking about this, we can kind of understand what our boundaries are a little bit? Because otherwise we could easily just end up talking around it.
For me, there's a lone wolf type understanding when I think of narcissism, alone at the top kind of vibe. And again, I'm going with associations to my experience of mine and others' narcissism more so than like going down the line of the DSM right now, right? Like the grandiosity is the biggest thing that helps me clue into it, but culturally understanding narcissism, I think there's a lot of loneliness in it. There's a lot of, I am not allowed to depend on other people. And I have a lot of needs, but I have to act as if I don't need anything. I have to puff my chest out. I once had a supervisor when I was working at a foster adoption agency tell me that she thought narcissism was like a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade balloon, right? They're huge, right? Going down 6th Avenue, I think it is in New York City. And they're just full of hot air. Right. And there's just so much fear, I think, in a narcissistically featured moment, right? Or a self or a presentation that we're so scared to admit that we have vulnerabilities. Like that's another one that comes from me.
Gotcha. So we all have these different self states, right? We've talked about that before. Listener, link in the show notes to our previous podcast episode about that. And one of them is this narcissistic self, right? That you're saying like everybody's got this. The narcissistic self is grandiose, but it's also very isolated, disconnected from others. That disconnection maybe means that when you're in a narcissistic state or in a narcissistic place, your own subjective experience, your own personal experience of the world kind of takes over everything. You have a hard time even imagining other people's experience of a thing. If I feel cold, then everyone must be cold, so I'll turn on the heat. If we are in a narcissistic place, that would be one of the assumptions you'd make. But I'm also hearing that there is a kind of vulnerability in it, a fragility inside, connected to that loneliness and isolation that the grandiosity seems to serve to protect. You get to feel big. You can do it on your own. You have to do it on your own because there's some softness inside, some tenderness inside.
Right.
It's being protected.
Yeah. And I think I would argue that while in a narcissistic state, in the actual real time, in the moment, that it's a dissociative state.
Say more.
That we are tunneled, which is how I think of dissociation. Like you're not connected to other feelings you're having. You're not aware of other feelings you're having. You're not aware of many other thoughts, thought patterns. Dissociation is a tunneling experience. And I think narcissistic moments, we just tend to be dissociated. We tend to be tunneled. And so like that is the only truth that we can hold on to in that moment.
Yeah, this is an interesting shift because oftentimes when people talk about dissociation, there can be a lot of language of like floatiness or disconnection. And the image is a little bit more of someone sort of separating from the ground, right? Of floating off into a dissociated state. But what I'm hearing you say is that in terms of like different self states, right? The dissociation isn't a sort of like floating into nothingness. It's sort of being stuck within a particular perspective, a particular way of experiencing the world and yourself.
Yeah, I think it can be both.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, but I think when we talk about narcissism, I like to use the analogy, and maybe we've talked about this before, of a car, right? Or a bus or a 15-passenger van. And inside the vehicle are all these different parts of who we are. The narcissistic state of mind, the dissociation that happens there is that that part of us is grabbing the wheel, right?
Yeah.
But other parts of us might dissociate by being kicked to the very back of the van or something, and we're just trying to like, yeah, here, hide under the seat. Like you don't exist. I don't want you to be seen by anybody. Maybe it's our needy self or something. We're like, get under there. And that's dissociation in that sense, or our abused self, right? That's a common one. Like stay in the back of the van, don't come out. I just don't think that the way the narcissistic state of mind works, it's going to dissociate by doing anything other than grabbing the wheel and like acting as if no one else is in the car. And being like, we're the only one here. And if we want Taco Bell right now, we're going to get Taco Bell.
Right. In the sort of theoretical framework and language that you and I both are more embedded in, dissociation is the way that we talk about self states disconnecting.
Yep.
And it sounds like the narcissistic mode of dissociation is this sort of white knuckling it. Sort of saying like, this is the part of me that's taking over and nothing else is getting in, and this is what we're up to.
Right.
And that's that. And any other bits of self have a really hard time making their way into that sort of conference room, into the place where people are making decisions.
Right. And I think what makes narcissism most problematic is when we can't have recognition, or we don't have recognition or awareness of the moment where that happened. Where we could say, oh shit, my narcissistic self just grabbed the wheel there and it might have hurt you, or tell me if it hurt you, or wow, I wish that hadn't happened, right? And something about naming it, I think, depathologizes it. It takes it out of this binary of, bad or good. It just is. Right. Like it has the possibility to be good if it helps us get the job, but it has a capacity to really hurt a relationship if we're always turning the heat up in the house because we're cold and the other person is warm.
What I'm hearing you say is that the trouble with narcissism is that it's hard to acknowledge.
I think that's the full circle moment culturally, because other people who have narcissism, right? So we say like, you're bad, so why would I dare admit that I am narcissistic, or I have narcissistic features? And I think that's what makes NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, I think that's what makes it come alive and be something that is actually diagnosable, because people in culture or people in that person's life have said, that's bad, you're bad. And so then they get more closeted about it. And the more closeted you get about your narcissism, the more it leaks out and the more problematic it is, because you're not able to own it and try to pivot from the negative behaviors that come from it and acknowledge and repair the problems that it caused.
Yeah. I'm thinking about how like there are a lot of mental health diagnoses that people are told that's bad, but we can talk about it a little bit easier. This is common in the world of neurodivergence, right? Or neurodiversity. Affirming treatment is often about helping people to accept parts of themselves that all throughout their life they were told, that's bad, don't be weird, right? And we are able to have that conversation culturally in this moment right now. Is there something about the dynamics of narcissism, the way that it functions, that makes it so difficult to discuss? Or is this just a weird moment in time?
That's a tricky one.
I gave you a binary, which is inherently a false and cruel thing to do to someone, but
They exist in the world, though, unfortunately.
They do.
Or fortunately in certain circumstances, perhaps. But it's hard for me to not think about patriarchy and marginalized communities and all of that when thinking about your question. Because I think there's been a reckoning that has been happening more and more in the past decade, past 5 years, even specifically, that I think has helped draw attention to the extreme negative effects of narcissism. And that I think narcissism can be so associated with patriarchy for good reason. I think, though, then it's hard to name one's narcissism if it's going to be associated with something that's so destructive in our world.
Right.
Even though I think it's still important. And I actually think that that's a way to help dismantle the patriarchy is to start having conversations about narcissism. And for people like me, a white, straight, cis male, to start talking to other people that identify like I do and say, hey, we got to start owning this, right? It starts with us in so many ways. Then it becomes safer to have conversations overall about something that, again, does not have to be so bad if it's named.
Right. Okay. My brain went into 100 different directions at once.
No, that was a curveball.
No, I love it. I love it. I love it. I'm thinking about a couple things. One of the things I'm thinking about is the role of shame in narcissism. That a lot of times it feels like the narcissistic state can be a reaction to the threat of shame. That shame is involved. In my narcissism, I find this to be true. And working with clients who had predominantly narcissistic parts of themselves, I found that oftentimes getting into that narcissism involved encountering shame. And if I were to give a catchphrase to shame, it would be, don't look at me.
Right.
And I wonder if that's part of this as well. Part of this difficulty is that if we are to acknowledge narcissism in ourselves and to one another, then that's kind of like walking around naked a little bit. Narcissism exists to protect deep vulnerability often. And to acknowledge the reality of narcissism risks exposing that deep vulnerability. And that's terrifying.
Yeah, I concur. I also think shame can create or incur a narcissistic state to then cover it up, but then there can be shame about a narcissistic self being exposed, and it's just a vicious cycle. And I do think that in order to have a generative moment with our narcissistic self in relationship to others, we have to have a little bit of shame. Like I think we have to have regulated shame because there's some element of don't look at me that is at least close to, I think I did something that hurt someone.
Brian, you're blowing my shit up. Okay, this whole podcast is like, let's talk about narcissism in a way that is not as depathologizing and a little countercultural. And in the middle of it, you're like, oh, by the way, modulated shame is good. No one on Psychology Today is going to listen to this. This goes against all the common pop psych out there. I'm making a joke. And like, it is a little bit revolutionary within the world of using psychologized language to talk about how to make sense of our lives, to suggest the two things you're suggesting here, to engage with narcissism as a natural human part of self, and to suggest that there might be a healthy function to shame. Those are two things that people tend to not engage with very much.
Yeah. Part of it might be that I've heard the differentiation between shame and guilt, and that, guilt is what's needed because it's related to one's actions and shame is related to one's character.
Right.
I can work with that, but I also am like, I don't know how we can just completely avoid shame. And so that there's part of me that's like, if it's going to be there, let's use it. Let's try to regulate it and let it point us toward loving ourselves and loving others and opening our eyes a little bit. So that's part of where that comes from. I just want something that feels like it's just naturally going to be there,
right?
To be useful.
I feel like in this conversation and in our previous conversation, one of the sort of underlying themes that you've come with is this idea that, like, if it's in you, okay. And that's where we start.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm hearing you say. Like narcissism, it's in you. Okay. Let's start there. Shame, it's in you. Okay. What are we going to do about this? And I think that part of what I hear in this, let me know if I'm misreading you, is that this is a bit of a response to a human tendency that I think is pretty broadly human, not tied to any particular culture, of like, oh, that's bad, so I should make it go away.
Right.
The reaction that I'm hearing, or the response I'm hearing from you is, well, it's here, so let's be a little curious about it.
Yeah, which is risky and dangerous. It takes a lot of courage. I very much see that. I know that in my own life. Like, I don't want to look at stuff. I want to disavow parts of myself often, right? That's what that is. It's like no, you don't exist. And I just think that tends to create more problems when we disavow a feeling, a self, a part of who we are.
Right. Yeah. IFS might call that the exiled parts.
Yep. As a self, if I'm going through that lens, I just think the lack of acknowledgement to ourselves and to, the people that we're in relationship with when it shows up is the most problematic factor.
Yeah.
It really is. Like, I think, and maybe to add on to that, the inability to pivot, right? Like, if we just keep doing the same thing that comes out of our narcissistic self to the same person in our life, and we're like, oops, sorry, my bad. My narcissistic self showed up. And then we just do it again. Oops, sorry, my bad. That was my narcissistic self. And we can't actually pivot and improve relationships. I do think there will be an effect, right? The relationship will suffer.
Yeah.
We will probably suffer.
Right. I feel like that's the trouble that comes with a lot of psychological theory, right? It's one thing to know a thing.
Yep.
It's something else entirely to live a thing.
Yeah.
There's lots of people out there who can say, oh, I had a trauma response and that's why I did that awful thing to you. And they're going to say that for years and years and years and years and years. It's another thing entirely to engage with your traumatized self and to begin to experience the world and yourself differently in a way that means that you're not going to keep doing that thing to people.
Exactly. Yeah.
What I'm hearing you say is there's a risk of that when talking about narcissism as well. And I think that's true of any psychological category, right?
Fair.
Like
Yep.
Understanding is very different than feeling through. I was thinking about a conversation that I had with somebody where sometimes as a therapist, when you're talking to someone, you feel the presence of a self state more than you define it. It's almost like a taste or a smell. It's like there's something here that feels traumatized. There's something here that feels borderline-y or splitty, and different theories use different language for it, right? There's something here that feels narcissistic, right? So I was having that experience with someone where they were talking about something, and there was something in me that was like, there's something here that feels, what is it? I'm feeling, what is this? And they were describing the way that someone had reacted to a way that they'd hurt this other person's feelings. And there were a group of folks whose feelings had been hurt. And there's this one person who responded really negatively. And the person I was speaking to said, and those other folks, they responded a lot more human. And what I found myself saying in response to them was, hang on a minute, because that person who reacted really negatively, you hurt them. It seems pretty human to react negatively when you're hurt. I'm mentioning that because I feel like that right there, that dynamic of a narcissistic state not allowing for other people's experiences. We've used the word subjectivity a few different times. When I say subjectivity, I mean someone's experience of the world. That includes emotional experiences, that includes physical sensations, what story they're living, the whole kit and caboodle, right? I find when someone's in a narcissistic state, including myself, other people's subjectivities are not allowed.
Right.
It's only the one. And that can be so deeply off-putting.
For sure.
And I think also can be the root of a lot of the downstream negative impacts when narcissism is allowed to run wild. Because when other people's subjectivities don't matter, their pain doesn't matter, their suffering doesn't matter, that your relationship with them doesn't matter, and eventually on a socio-political level, their lives don't matter.
Right. There's a lot of othering that goes into it, and it does feel like a snowball falling down a hill in my mind, right? Because we can say, oh gosh, yeah, the way that person acted, that was so narcissistic. And yet it becomes at least a question, is my narcissism showing up while I say that?
Right.
And if so, what's going on, right? And again, okay, if it does, can we acknowledge it, or can we see it, or is there space to be curious and go, whoa, gosh, I'm kind of acting like I'm better than that person that acted like that. I thought they were acting like they were better than the other person. And to dismantle that process can be huge when it comes to understanding how we navigate the world, especially a world of lots of difference and a lot of strife.
Yeah. There's kind of a feedback loop that can happen. When I experience my subjectivity being invalidated, my temptation is to respond by saying, no, yours is dumb. Your subjectivity is wrong, not mine.
Right.
And then what I'm hearing you say is that might be part of the trouble that we get in. That's a narcissistic action that I'm getting caught up in.
Right.
Disavowing someone else's subjectivity. And then we get caught in a loop.
Right. Versus the idea that like, oh my gosh, I'm having some feelings right now and they really matter. They do. They just matter, right? The idea that like no baby pops out of the womb in a way that we would clinically diagnose as narcissistic.
Right.
It's just, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
We have a need to be heard and seen and even treated like we're special sometimes, right? Like that's a common understanding of people who are narcissistic. Oh, that they need to be treated like they're absolutely special. And I'm of the idea that like, I think we do need that. I think the degree to which or the amount that we walk around asking for that, yeah, it's probably not going to work out. But the feeling and the desire to be treated like you're special, you're set apart, you're amazing. Like, I mean, I'm just thinking of an infant that is like crying and it's like, I need mom's attention right now more than anything else that mom has going on. And
yes,
we look at that and we're like, that's a valid feeling. It maybe can't be delivered upon even a majority of the time.
Right.
But it's valid.
Yeah. And it's important to be delivered on some of the time.
Yeah, for sure.
I think even in adult attachment relationships between partners, even, there are times when I make a joke and I really need my wife to think it's funny.
For sure.
I really do a lot. And if she doesn't, oh my narcissism is wounded.
Yes. Yep.
But another thing that I want to get at is you said just now, nobody comes out of the womb with narcissistic personality disorder, right? And I think that that's something that people are more open to it now than they even were like 5 years ago.
Sure.
But there's a collection of the personality disorders in the DSM that there was a tendency for a number of years to say, well, some people are just like this. And that was like a thing that people kind of agreed to go along with. I'm seeing people move away from that now,
right?
Especially interestingly around borderline personality disorder. When people talk about borderline personality disorder on the internet and places like that, they're more likely to point at like, hey, this is actually traumagenic, meaning something happened. Something happened to make this come about. And I'm hearing you say that for people who might meet criteria for the narcissistic personality disorder, they weren't born that way. They became that way.
Yeah, and my image of it, which comes from some experience working with people, my own experience, and also just some imagination, is that anytime that person that we would diagnose as having MPD, that they were not paid attention to when they had needs, and especially probably significant needs. And so they had to learn to go inward in a lot of ways and kind of live in this world where, okay, my needs have to be important, but I'm not seeing it relationally. So I have to invent a way of being in this world where those needs are important.
The needs feel really big, but they're not being responded to. I need to make myself big.
Yep.
And in so doing, that bigness becomes my source of safety.
Yep.
Oh, that's kind of sad.
Yeah.
That's really sad. That doesn't sound like a demon. That sounds like a sad person.
Right. Underneath the narcissistic cover self that we put out there in those moments, I think we're deeply wounded.
Yeah.
By trauma, by the world. And I think there's this idea of like, let's get rid of the narcissism instead of going, oh no, there was an original need there to just be seen, right? To feel free to live in the world. Like think about a little kid, like a 4 or 5 year old that's just like dancing freely, and they're like, look at me, like it's beautiful. And very few people would argue otherwise, right? And yet when that 4 or 5-year-old is a 36-year-old and, it's a different behavior, we're instantly like, you're bad.
Right. And that feels bad.
Right.
I could throw another curveball at you.
Yeah, feel free to throw the curveball. There's nothing else that...
Hello, listener. Editor Tyson here. The curveball that I'm about to throw to Brian has to do with the category of borderline states or a borderline personality structure. And I just wanted to give a little bit of context here that didn't come up in the conversation because Brian and I are both so deep in this world that we just have assumptions about what these things mean and didn't define it super well in the conversation. The thing that you need to know, listener, is that borderline personality disorder is another diagnosis in the DSM that shares a lot of traits with narcissistic personality disorder. Not entirely, but a lot. And I think the briefest shorthand for it would be that in the same way that we're talking about narcissism in this episode being about sort of a bigness of self, a bigness and a just me-ness of experience of one sense of self, a borderline self-state or borderline personality disorder can be defined by bigness of feeling. That's the big distinction. Narcissism can be about bigness of self, either in a positive way or a negative way, but it's grandiose and it's big. Whereas borderline is often about bigness of feelings. Everything feels very big and oftentimes leads to a lot of expressions of that bigness of feeling that can seem out of step with how other people are experiencing a moment or an encounter or a relationship. So that's really, really oversimplified. We could do a whole series of podcasts about these various categories of thinking about personality and emotional states. But just going into this conversation that's about to happen, please know narcissism, big sense of self, borderline, big feeling state. So hopefully it all makes sense. Here's the curveball. The curveball is there seems to be some kind of meaningful relationship between whatever we consider narcissistic and whatever we consider borderline. And I know we're not talking about that today, but we are. And we also talked about gender, and that feels involved in whatever this relationship is between what we consider narcissist and what we consider borderline. The same presentation when assigned to a male patient will more often be diagnosed as narcissistic. When assigned to a female patient, more likely to be diagnosed as borderline. It's been a while since I saw the research, but that's what I recall.
Right.
Any thoughts about that?
It just feels unfortunate that that gender binary and diagnostic binary has gone that direction. Yeah, it feels inaccurate, right?
Yeah.
I know that people who have covert narcissism or inverted narcissism just tend to be people who are not as demonstrative and not as loud and not as passionate. And I'm using words that have both negative and positive connotations in our world.
Right.
And probably because of patriarchy, that has been more men that have been more loud and demonstrative and seen as passionate, all these different things. So, I mean, it just feels like a really, really unfortunate and downright stupid breakdown with gender and borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. It just, yeah. I just kind of look at it and I'm like, that's shitty.
Yeah.
It doesn't, it doesn't compute in my current work with people. I feel like I see both features of both disorders across genders.
Yeah.
Outside
absolutely.
the binary even.
In some of the ways I've been thinking about borderline dynamics, I'm wondering if this is also true of narcissism. I work with a lot of teenagers, and listener, if you're curious about what a borderline mental state looks like, remember being a teenager. It's a lot like that. That's what borderline mental states are. Everything is the biggest and the most intense and the most overwhelming and the most unsolvable. There's no catastrophizing like 14-year-old catastrophizing, man. And that's what it feels like. and the response that the broader world has to your feelings of distress, of rolling their eyes and going like, oh, someone's being a teenager, has a tendency to amplify
For sure.
that distress. So like, there's my back of the napkin version of a borderline state. And in my experience, when someone's in a borderline state, the point is that they're inconsolable.
Right.
The point is that the experience that they're having can't be resolved by a good enough listener or by a good enough attachment figure. The point is that this distress is so all-encompassing that, like, no, there's nothing that can be done but acknowledging its reality.
Right.
And so what I'm wondering is if, as you're talking about this like narcissistic kind of origin of like needing the attention and not getting it, needing the recognition and it's not there, needing the face of the other and that face is blank, I'm wondering if that's similarly unresolvable. Like you cannot be a empathic and kind enough friend or therapist or partner to heal someone's narcissism retroactively.
Yeah.
The point is it wasn't there when you needed it, and that can't be undone, and that sucks.
Right. It sucks, and I don't know about the concept of healing narcissism in general, right?
Right,
And that's what you're getting at. I think it's more of like we learn how to regulate that part of who we are so it doesn't ruin our life.
And it seems like part of regulating it is acknowledging it in its fullness, which includes its like intractability. That like this narcissistic experience, it's not going away. Like, yeah, there's a part of you that is so big and people don't see it, or people react poorly to it, or it still hurts. And yeah, that's part of what's going on. Or maybe to claim it a little bit more closely, there's a narcissistic part of me that will never feel fully acknowledged, and that's painful. But if I allow that to coexist with all the other parts of me, then I can manage it a lot easier.
And manage it, and going back to what I was saying near the beginning, perhaps even employ it when it's needed, right? Like your narcissistic self showing up for a job interview is probably going to help you get the job. Your narcissistic self being there at your birthday party, you're probably going to have a really good time.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like I have to tap into my narcissistic self every time I email anyone to come on this podcast.
Love it. Yeah.
Because if I didn't, then, like I wouldn't be big enough to warrant their attention.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's really, I think, what we're talking about here, right? There's an injury.
Yeah.
There's something that wasn't there that was needed. And by us giving that part of who we are, that attention, yeah, it doesn't make it go away. That's not the point. What it does is it helps us feel like, oh, that happened and it wasn't the last word. Right. And in fact, you belong here, narcissistic self. You can help me get a job. You can be awesome on a first date. You can have so much fun at your birthday party. You could, dream big and help us start something that's really awesome in the world.
Yeah. So I kind of stumbled into saying whether or not I deserve their attention, right? In sending the email. Without my narcissism, I don't feel like this project would deserve their attention and time. And that made me think about this video producer and actor, Abigail Thorne. She makes Philosophy Tube, and she's going to be in one of the new Star Wars shows. Anyway, on the internet, somebody asked her about acting. Like, how do you act good? What's a bit of advice you have? And what she said was that when she was in acting school, there was a teacher who someone said, like, I just need to figure out, I just need to be more confident on stage. I need to be more confident. And the teacher said, no, you don't. Confidence? Your character's not confident right now. You're performing the Hamlet soliloquy. He's not confident. What you need to be is entitled. You are entitled to the stage. You are an actor. It's your job to be up there. You're entitled to it, so take it.
Yep.
And that idea, I think that's true of a lot of things, actually. Being unconfident and uncertain, but entitled to be there, as a category, has been really helpful to me as a therapist ever since learning it. And I just now made that connection in my mind of, is that a definition of healthy narcissism? To be entitled to what you are genuinely entitled to.
Yeah. I wonder, what's interesting about that, if we're to kind of follow the rabbit trail a little bit, was when you said what you said about, whether you deserve their attention to come on the show.
Right, yeah.
Ever since working with my supervisor, Doug Hansen, for a number of years, I've always had a complicated relationship with the word deserve.
Mm.
And that came from him. He would often tell me, like, well, I mean, how are we supposed to determine what we deserve? We might need something, we might want something, but deserve is so challenging to kind of play with.
Yeah.
But I'm willing to rethink it with what you're saying about entitlement, right? Okay, deserve maybe is connected to human rights in some form or another, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so need and want, maybe they don't feel strong enough sometimes. Maybe there needs to be a word that has a bit more of a kind of global vibe to it. Like, in my life, in these things, in this place, I deserve fill in the blank.
Right. And in the spirit of one of the evolving sub-themes of this season of this podcast, which has been expanding ideas from individual intrapsychic, one-person psychology kind of ways of thinking to thinking more broadly, societally, culturally, I think to be entitled to something is largely dependent on context.
Yeah.
An actor is entitled to the stage unless they haven't been cast in that show.
Yeah.
I am entitled to my wife's attention unless our daughter is screaming on the floor. There's a kind of social reality that's co-created that we all build together and have disagreements about.
Right.
And that's, I think, where the entitlement can come from. Maybe. I don't know. I'm just making shit up on a microphone. Is someone recording this? Stop that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think to play with it and to run with the idea of, like, run slowly enough with the idea that healthy narcissism could be a relationship with entitlement, that if we hold it loosely enough, that when someone else does not meet us there, we are able to grieve. That I'm kind of like, okay, I can roll with that, right? We're able to feel the loss, versus if we're gripping tight to the entitlement,
right,
we're not grieving, and in fact, we might cause some damage because we feel that entitlement. And if they don't acknowledge it, then we might feel entitled to force it.
Which would be potentially violent.
Yeah, abusive.
Damaging.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So as we're making our way 60 seconds at a time to the end of our time today, what are we going to do about
it? Yeah, just ignore it, right? That's all.
Great. Good job. You finished doing your laundry, listener.
Therapy helps. Maybe the reason that therapy helps in this specific area is that maybe if we have enough of an attachment that feels enough of a connection relationally with our therapist, that our narcissistic self can show up in a slightly safer environment than out in the wild.
Yeah.
And that therapy relationship can serve as a mirror, and that we can look at our narcissism, again, in a slightly safer environment, and kind of go, oh, and deal with that shame, maybe regulate the shame, and get to a place where we can be like, okay, that exists in me, and it's going to show up out in the real world. It probably already is. And the fact that I can have some moments here where it shows up and nobody died, maybe I can do this, right? Maybe I can let this part of me show up, be present in, and again, as if it's not already showing up in our closest relationships.
Right. The thing I keep thinking about in this conversation is that it seems to be that, like, a distillation of the argument is that the narcissism can be quite useful and healthy when it is in active relationship with the other parts of self.
Yep.
And oftentimes, active relationship with other parts of self comes from having someone outside of your own self to do the introductions.
Yep.
Someone coming into your life and saying, hey, Brian, this is your narcissistic self. I'd like to introduce it to your scared self and your happy self and your whatever other humble self, all the other selves.
Yep.
People need people. And that's one of the ways that we make use of one another.
Right. Because in that moment of a narcissistic feature showing up, or narcissistic self showing up in a relationship, I think it literally is those other selves, right? Maybe a more mature self or an observing self that can speak to us in our head. Be like, whoa, your narcissistic self just showed up. Or, hey, narcissism, thanks for being here. You're probably here for a reason. We don't know why yet, but you just made that person feel bad. So like, which is against the goal we have for this relationship. So like, let's dial it back a little bit, right? That literally can become something that happens either unconsciously or even consciously and intentionally in those moments. And then we were able to maybe say those words to the other person. Hey, my narcissism just showed up. Did it injure you? And if they say, yeah, you can be like, I am sorry. I'm going to do everything I can to not have that happen again.
And I do think that a lot of folks who are afraid of being narcissistic might find that their narcissistic self shows up a lot and doesn't actually hurt anybody.
Right.
Sometimes the things that you feel entitled to, other people agree you are entitled to.
Yes.
Sometimes other people saying happy birthday to you is something that everyone agrees is good.
Yep.
Unless you're a particular kind of introvert, in which case it is hell.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
Give it a chance. Give your narcissistic self a chance.
Yeah.
Listen to them. They're not the devil. They're not horrible. They're probably really misunderstood.
Yeah. And giving that part of yourself a chance also means opening yourself up to some pain.
Yes. And some shame.
Yeah. So if someone's heard this conversation and is like, this is fascinating, I would like to learn more. Or, this was fascinating, but my gosh, those guys don't cite their sources. Where are these ideas coming from? What recommendations would you have for them?
Well, I think Narcissistically, my book
is
I write a lot about the narcissistic self in my book, which is called The Curtain, Tales of Human Love and Personality. You can get it on Amazon. When you asked me about this, I was like, what resources come to mind? And for me, I think it was like, I've just been spending lots of time kind of outside the realm of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and psychology proper. And so the show Beef on Netflix was just like such a beautiful example of the morphing of narcissism in my mind, right? It's classically in its like presentation about anger and rage, but I saw narcissism, right? I saw narcissism develop between multiple characters and get to a point where it can look closer to what I think healthy narcissism can be. So that's the first one that came to mind. And then the second one, it's only because I'm in this world, I'm like, go to a comedy club for open mic night and just sit there. You're going to cringe because open mic nights tend to be a mix of everything. It's terrible and it's sometimes really beautiful. And it really feels like an exercise in people, both audience members and people going on stage, wrestling with narcissism. Yeah. Because even if you're an audience member that's not going on stage, which there usually are a lot of those, you're sitting up there going, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing this. I'm better than them. Like you just notice that stuff. And it's oh, if you want to get in touch with your narcissism, if you want to like feel it and maybe see it more clearly in real life in other people, strangers, go to a comedy club on open mic night. Yeah. Just give it a shot. And I've done a few recently, and one felt like I massively struggled and had to deal with my narcissistic injury in that moment. Yeah. And another one that went quite well and got to feel really esteemed because of it. And so you don't have to get up on stage, but like give it a visit sometime. Yeah, that's great. If someone's hearing this and is like, I'm too terrified to go to an open mic night, I just want to read a book. I really like Neville Sevington's Narcissism book. That book is really good. Strong recommend, but I think that there's probably some wisdom in going out and feeling what it's like as compared to reading what it might be like. I mean, we all learn differently, so. Yes, and oftentimes when it comes to things that we have a hard time claiming within ourselves, we might want to pretend we're observing it outside of ourselves. And your invitation is to observe it from the inside out, which I think is valuable.
Brian, thank you so much for your time, for coming on to this show, for coming on to the last show, for encouraging me to keep making podcasts.
Yeah, I mean, your narcissistic self needs to be fed a little bit here. You're great at this.
Oh, thank you. And I am entitled to this microphone.
Yes.
Well, great. Thank you. I'm sure we'll have you on again.
Looking forward to it.
Special thanks to Brian Pendergast. Brian's book, The Curtain, Tales of Human Love and Personality, can be found on Amazon. The link to his book, his social media, and our recommendations for further learning can be found in the show notes. We'll be back in 2 weeks with my conversation with Grayson Moody, where we discuss the limitations of empathy in psychotherapy. This has been The Way In. This show is hosted and produced by me, Tyson Connor, with music by Ben Lewis and visual art by Dan Lane. If you enjoyed this show, please rate, review, subscribe, follow, like, share, star, heart, reblog, retweet, repost, upvote, or in some meaningful way engage with the episode on your digital platform of choice. I'm told it makes a big difference for exposing more people to the show. And if you think someone you know may like this episode, you could also just tell them about it. You can follow the show on social media, where we are at The Way In Pod. There you can give me feedback, tell me a joke, and see high-resolution versions of the individual episode art, which I highly recommend. I think Dan did a great job. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.